you very much, Nancy. I'm delighted to be here. I'm known for having way too much material. That's not my strength as a teacher. So hopefully, I may buzz through a few slides and not cover absolutely everything that I planned on covering. This is going to be a real sort of mixture of ideas and thoughts and material for you this morning. I wanted to both give you a sense of what's known today science-wise, behavioral science-wise in terms of sleep and adolescence, but I also wanted to give you a flavor for some of the things that I do with my students when I'm teaching, both specifically with regard to adolescence and sleep, but more broadly sleep. I teach an undergraduate course specifically on, it's called Sleep and Behavior, and so I'm sort of going to dabble a little bit in some of the things I do in that course, as well as the science and what I would be doing if I were speaking to you to just share some of my research. So it's going to be a real mixture. Bear with me because we're going to go back and forth. I'm also going to get you kind of moving around or in some small groups before we finish up this morning. All that in 90 minutes. We will see how that works. For starters, what I'd love for you to do is one of the handouts. I'm rather old-fashioned. I just yesterday was in an iPad workshop, and yet I'm still kind of paper and pencil when I hand things out. If you could take the sleep quiz, take just a couple of minutes to fill that out. And this is something you can take and adapt for your own purposes with your high school students. I've been using these questions for years. I won't we won't go through all of them, but after you do it, we're going to just go through a couple of them. And the one handout I have not given you are the answers, so you can take that on your way out. So if you could just take a couple of minutes to fill that out, the sleep quiz. You should be done by now. So I want to go through a couple of them, and this is really to get you thinking about sleep and circadian rhythms. So let's just take a look at the very first question. Students fall asleep in classes because teachers are boring. True or false, and what's your explanation for your answer? Okay, and why is that false? Yes. Just say your first name, just so yeah.
Very impolitic answer to say that professors are boring. That's why students.
All right, but what's the scientific or what's the explanation for why this?
There many other factors involved in why they're falling.
Okay, can someone say anything specific about sleep, just in terms of your knowledge about sleep?
Depends on what kind of time of day it is.
Well, so it could be time of day, absolutely, but
Should be the lack of sleep is going to just make you're just going to.
Exactly. We have I realize that we're talking here about teaching psychology courses, but we have a biological drive to sleep. We can only stay awake so long, and we are going to fall asleep. Now, it's true, time of day, certainly teaching adolescents, at those of you who teach in high schools that start before 8:30 or so in the morning, are going to have the experience of having students, if you teach in first or even second period classes, who may be sleepy, relating to the time of day or getting an inadequate amount of sleep the night before. Those of you who have students sometimes around the lunch period may find that students are sleepy for other reasons. So there is time of day can be a factor. Also, lighting can be a factor. So not you personally, not your teaching style necessarily, but if you teach at 7:30 in the morning and you show a film in your AP psychology class and you put all the lights off, I don't care how exciting the film is, you may have a higher percentage of students who don't see the film, so to speak. But by and large, I think that the main point that I want to make with this, in terms of really your teaching experience, not just the knowledge, is that if you have a student class after class who falls asleep, that's a student that you need to draw attention to. That's a student that you should be talking to that student. That's a student who you should be bringing to the school nurse's attention and so on. That would not be sort of within normal range to do that day after day after day. And that's not my focus for today, but I'm happy to answer questions about that later on. I'm going to talk a lot about question 3 in a couple of minutes, so we won't talk about that one. But let's see. How about
How about question 5? Effects of sleep loss add up over the course of several nights and days. True or false? True. Okay, so that's absolutely true. Can someone say anything about that, or any more? Yeah.
We accumulate what's called sleep debt.
Exactly. Now, you can do something about it. I mean, to assume that you can't, we can't make up for. We accumulate a sleep loss, unfortunately, with our modern 24/7 lives, or more than 24/7 lives, no matter what. But we can make up for some sleep loss in the sense that we can sleep more on the weekends, and teenagers unfortunately do what we call binge sleeping, which is problematic and then causes other difficulties. Also, being on an erratic schedule, whether we're an adolescent or an adult, is problematic, and so too much of that, sleeping, say, on one schedule during the week and another schedule on weekends, is problematic. And most of the research suggests, particularly with adolescents, that more than a 90-minute, some research says only a 60-minute difference in the timing of your sleep, that irregular or erratic schedule can be have negative implications. So when we're looking at sleep, we're not just looking at sleep duration, but we're always looking at other sleep-wake variables, and we can talk more about that. Number 9, over 100,000 car accidents yearly are related to sleepiness. True or false? It's true, and it's probably closer to 200,000, to tell you the truth. And adolescents, particularly male adolescents, as well as college-age students, are the age group that is at greatest risk for fall asleep at the wheel motor vehicle accidents. And that's without alcohol. When you combine alcohol in the case, there's actually a synergistic effect that puts you at even greater risk. One of the nightmare kinds of stories that you read about is the college student who, it's say Thanksgiving break, and you go to college in Worcester, Massachusetts, but your family lives in Virginia, and your parents have put great pressure on you to get home for Thanksgiving. Classes end, but you want to socialize with your friends, so you stay on the college campus if it's a campus that allows you to do this, and then you get on the road, say if it's Tuesday or Wednesday, regardless of the day, and you don't leave campus until 9 o'clock in the evening, and then you head home to get to the DC area. High risk situation for 2 reasons. That individual is sleep deprived. That individual may have been drinking, but even without the alcohol, sleep deprived. And then the time of day, and we'll talk about circadian rhythms in a couple of minutes, but the time of day, if you picture sort of that 8-hour or 9-hour drive, they may be getting into the DC area in the dawn hours, and the drive to sleep in terms of where our circadian clock is the greatest in those early dawn hours, or that's a very sleepy time, similar to the actual natural time that we're more likely to be ready to go to sleep. That's another high risk period of time. So there's a combination, I'm going to talk about this in a couple of minutes, of what we call sleep pressure or homeostatic sleep pressure and our circadian timing that sort of create this awful situation at that time. So it isn't just sleep deprivation. What's that? Yeah.
I did everything she said, but I wasn't drinking. And I hit a telephone pole because I drove through a traffic light, sound asleep, an intersection, and hit a traffic pole in front of the bank, in front of the apartments where I was on my way home. So I was right in front of my apartment when it happened.
Yeah, that's not uncommon.
Yeah, very scary.
So something to think about. Number 11, caffeinated sodas, coffee, hot chocolate, and other sources of caffeine can help keep you awake. True or false? Pretty simple question if you first look at it. Okay. You'd be surprised the number of adults, I'm sure we've all been in the situation where you have a lovely evening together with some friends, you've had a couple of drinks, dessert time comes around, and your host or hostess says, would you like caffeinated or decaf? And the number of people say, oh, I want some caffeine, it doesn't bother me. I don't notice that I stay awake having caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant, and the only reason I bring this up with regard to your working with high school students and adolescent sleep, it's really a new area of research. I'm doing some work in this area myself. There's some suggestion that high caffeine use or caffeine use in adolescence or in late childhood may be an entry drug. My colleague Allison Ludden at Holy Cross is doing some work in this area. I don't have to tell you the number of adolescents, the growing number of adolescents, and I have a couple slides about this, and I could have done a whole morning just talking about stimulants and sleep and adolescent development as well, but I do think it's something that you need to be beginning to cover and to talk about, and I'd be happy to talk more about that, but we're in a Red Bull culture, unfortunately. And I don't think it's, I guess what I will say is I don't think it's coincidental that the attention, the wave of attention that is now, thankfully, in my opinion, sort of been covered by the media with regard to sleep deprivation, both broadly in terms of the general population, but specifically adolescents and college students, and at the same time we have had a growth in the caffeine industry. I was just in Starbucks now I should have brought the packets, it's actually, I kind of like it, but has this new, you go into most Starbucks this summer. Has anyone seen this? And they're selling these two types of drinks. You can get one that's like a berry flavor and one that's a lime flavor. And it is not limeade, it is lime flavored, but the actual product is the raw coffee beans that are being used to make this beverage. So there's caffeine in it. And the signs are like, refreshing, come in for the summer, refresh, and you can buy it in powder now, and you would not know it has caffeine unless you read the fine lines. In other words, it's not even being marketed as a caffeine drink, it's being marketed as a new way of using coffee beans. So go figure. The teenagers will be drinking that soon as well. I'm not going to do any more of these questions, but this is a lot of fun. I often start, if it's a unit relating to sleep, say I'm teaching a course on abnormal psych or intro psych, or in my upper level sleep course, it's a great way to just start a conversation on the topics, using this approach. I don't have to tell you that, but these are some of the questions. I'm not going to go over all of the handouts I've given you, but I just wanted to sort of give you a couple of samplings of the kinds of things that would be fun or useful in the classroom with high school students. I've given you a sleep-wake diary. This is mine. I've actually used this in an NIH-funded study with middle school students, and this is a sample. You're welcome to make use of it in any way that you'd like, but it's fun sometimes to have your students complete a sleep-wake diary, say for a week. And even with my college students, I will have them complete a sleep-wake diary for a week and then write a short kind of paper or analysis of the data. It's a fun way. I'm sure you have come up with different ways that you get students to understand data collection, but the sleep-wake diary works great because you can have students both pay attention to Likert kinds of scales, but also, hours of sleep or their sleep-wake schedule, have them do graphs of it and so on, and then sort of write about that. And I'm happy to sort of talk more about that, but I wanted you to see a sample sleep-wake diary. The next question is the next thing is the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. You can get this anywhere online these days, to tell you the truth, but this is used in sleep labs. This is a standard assessment that's used as sort of a very preliminary way of getting at whether someone may in fact have a sleep disorder. But I think, again, it's a great way to give your students a sense of measurement with regard to sleepiness. Unfortunately, and again, could be a whole class in and of itself, there's very poor reliability between self-report on sleepiness and if you were to do what we call an MSLT, which is a way of estimating sleepiness in a sleep lab. If any of you have family members who have been assessed for sleep apnea, sometimes they will stay overnight and then do this during the day. It's where you actually ask someone to try to fall asleep to see if they are going to fall asleep or not. If you're very sleepy, you'll fall asleep in under 5 minutes. If not, you won't fall asleep. They allow about a 20-minute window and also look to see what sleep stage you'll go into. And what's interesting is that with someone with a sleep disorder like sleep apnea, you're going to see some pretty high correlation between filling out the Epworth Sleepiness Scale and what happens in the lab. But for the person who's not suffering from a sleep disorder, there's actually very poor reliability. So in other words, an adolescent may be highly sleep deprived, but they might fill this out and depending on sort of the time of day and what's going on, you might look at it, or if you're doing it from a research perspective, and the person would not look sleepy at all. So yeah, you can have some fun with it.
Poor reliability between self-reporting
And any more objective measure like using polysomnography in a sleep lab. Yeah.
Two kind of related
Yeah.
questions that I'm always mystified by. In an apnea case, person has an apnea episode, does it completely disrupt wherever they are in the sleep cycle at that point? Does it completely disrupt it? They go back and start again, or even though they don't fully wake up, what does it do to their flow? Also, when you sleep, if we were in a sleep study and we were mapping your EEG, and you wake up kind of and stumble to the bathroom and go back to sleep again, kind of half awake, do you start over? Do you pick up where you were? Because you just said something where you said which sleep cycle they went into when they fell asleep. So can you say a little more?
Yeah. So I actually was not going to talk about sleep stages at all today, but I'm happy to, only because that could be we could spend the whole morning talking about polysomnography. But what I will say is that, does everyone know what the question is referring to? Okay. So in answer to your question, you don't necessarily start all over again. Now, whether you return exactly to where you were varies from individual to individual and how long you were awake. With sleep apnea, you absolutely sort of go back into whatever stage you were in, because those are that which is very different than getting up, going to the bathroom, getting back, trying to fall asleep. That's a sort of different experience, because with sleep apnea, these are seconds. Your sleep is grossly inefficient, and in fact the variable sleep efficiency is another interesting variable to have your students calculate, which is the number or estimate the percentage of time you're asleep relative to the time you're in bed, which are not necessarily the same. And individuals who have sleep disorders, might be restless leg syndrome, periodic limb movements in sleep apnea, have very poor sleep efficiency, or if you're just being awakened because of a baby all night long. But with sleep apnea, these are seconds you're waking up, and then you're falling back to sleep, and then you're waking up again. And someone with a very high severity index in sleep apnea, of course, is waking up lots and lots of times, but they're minimal amounts of time, but multiple times throughout the night. And in those individuals, likely they're sort of going back to sleep where they were. There's pretty minimal REM sleep, though, in sleep apnea. Anyone who's sleep deprived has less REM sleep, and what they'll experience, too, is sometimes REM onset during the day if they fall asleep, because we crave REM sleep if we're deprived of REM sleep. The next is one example. There are many of them of an owl-lark test, and this is terrific to do with your students to give them a little bit of a flavor for self-report on whether they're more lark or more owlish. Teenagers developmentally tend to be more owl-like than they were previously. That's not to say it's relative to where they were. But the average, sort of the average person, if you were to do thousands and thousands of morningness, eveningness questionnaires, most of us fall somewhere in the middle, which is interesting. Often people think they're lark-like, but then they're really far less lark-like than they thought they were, or vice versa. So these are just thought give you some sense of some of the assessment techniques. The final handout is just something very short that I created a number of years ago to give to middle school students. Shortly, or not that many years ago, it's pretty recent numbers. But Massachusetts is actually one of the few states that has started to think about sleepy driver issues and what we should be doing from a policy perspective to try to prevent sleepy driver motor vehicle accidents. So I thought you would find this interesting. And again, largely because you're working with teenagers. So that's what's in the packet. So I'm going to actually start and now go through some material, give you a sense of what I would be. I think most of this material is accessible to most of your high school students. You may need to tweak it somewhat, but also to educate you about what we know about adolescent sleep today. Let's see if I got these going the right way. Actually, I have to back up. I need to have you hear this for a second, if I can get to this website. This is a great video that you can actually purchase. It's called Who Needs Sleep. I'm not going to say anything. Just let you listen for 2 seconds.
Unique to the human. There is no animal that tries to sleep deprive itself.
Bunny eats sleep. Bunny eats sleep. Bunny eats sleep. I said I'm young, I'm strong, I could work hard all night long.
He lost his life simply for working hard.
One of the problems with the movie business is it does seem glamorous, and so there are a lot of people who would say, oh, I'll do anything.
When they talk about capitalism with a human face, it's an oxymoron. It can't be.
Nothing good happens when there's long hours.
For somebody who doesn't have regular work, they're not going to complain about their hours because they can't afford to.
I have a 5-year-old son, and I'd say that's where the conflict of this job comes in for me personally.
We're the only group of industrial workers in the world fighting for a 14-hour day.
Bunny eats sleep. Bunny eats sleep. Bunny eats sleep.
Let's see if I can get back to where I was now. Perfect. Okay. You can just look that up. It's Who Needs Sleep. If you go online, you can order the DVD. I use parts of it often when I start the semester again, or if I'm teaching my sleep course or for a unit on sleep. You probably wouldn't end up using the whole documentary, but it really gives students a sense of the real life implications of understanding problems with sleep deprivation and how that intersects with their lives and lifestyle. And it's about the movie industry, which I think works great with teaching adolescents. There's a little bit of historical information. As I said, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit between adolescent sleep and some broader topics. This is a really new area, and I feel like I can still say that. I really felt I could say it when I started teaching in the early 1990s, but it's amazing, really, and I think striking for your students, because unlike other dates, when you talk about something, often when I teach, of course, the 1960s seem recent too, but this is particularly recent for your students. In other words, the field was developing while their parents were starting their jobs, in essence. So. Sleep was certainly first characterized or described in the early 19th century, but from 1900 to the 1960s, there was virtually no description of sleep. There is one exception, and that's with regard to children. There's a little bit of discussion about sleep in children around the 1920s or so, but very, very, very minimal, both in the behavioral science literature as well as the clinical and medical world. REM sleep was first discovered in 1953, and non-REM sleep in its stages characterized in 1957. In 1961 was the founding of what's still called today the Sleep Research Society, a great place to get resources. It's actually a very minimal membership fee. It's the organization I belong to. Great website to check out also. 1971-72 was sort of the confirmatory discovery of the SCN, our actual biological clock. That's not that long ago. It's really, really striking in that regard. And you can really see these numbers. I won't go through all of them, but it wasn't until 1995, 1996 that the American Medical Association actually recognized sleep medicine as a sleep specialty. Physicians and other healthcare providers can now get boarded in sleep medicine. And in fact, there's a new exam for behavioral scientists now that's been developed. And 2012, just this past June, was the very first Society for Behavioral Sleep Medicine meeting. So it's a very new field. And I think that's sort of exciting when you're talking with high school students and undergraduates. These are questions I often use with my students as I'm starting a class, and I sort of try to fit them for you all, since you teach high school students, think back to your middle school years. This is for you guys to think back, but you can convert them. When did middle school start? What were your sleeping patterns like in middle school? And again, this is for your students as well. What were your sleeping patterns during your first year in high school? What about now? I think it really gets them to sort of individually get a sense of the developmental changes that occur in sleep. Worthwhile exercise for yourselves as well. There are really, I would argue today, 3 broad areas that determine human sleep. There is some, I think it's controversial. I'm someone who has a lot of doubts about the genetic implications of understanding sleep, or whether we really will be able to understand genetics with regard to sleep. That would be a whole nother discussion. But I do want to point out that it is a hot area of research right now. And there's some evidence for particularly circadian timing, genetic implications for those variables. I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about the bioregulatory processes with regard to sleep. I think it's very important to talk with your students about that, and particularly when you're talking about adolescent sleep. And then, of course, all of the behavioral, circumstantial, that is to say, clear research that socioeconomic status or environment or living conditions have implications for one's ability to get an adequate amount of sleep or a regular amount of sleep. Life choices, so again, when you're speaking with adolescents and talking about adolescent development, whether that's the time of day and when you do your homework, to caffeine, to all of the technology that adolescents are using. Those are choices that they make that may have negative implications for getting an adequate amount of sleep. And again, as adults, occupations, and again, back to that documentary about the film industry. So what happens over our lifespan? I'm just going to put these 3 categories up and talk about them a little bit. So some researchers use different terminology. You'll see the term sleep-wake homeostatic process, or you'll also see the term process S from Borbolet's work. But this is referring to, basically we have, there's a ratio going on throughout the day. Basically, the longer we go from when we last sleep, our biological drive to sleep gets greater. Okay, and that's what's really the sleep-wake homeostatic process. So literally, we become more sleepy relative to when we last slept or the amount of sleep we've been getting. At that point, when I'm just talking about process S, I'm not talking about time of day at all. And the best example, and I didn't bring this picture, but after the Oklahoma City bombings, a number of just like after any awful disaster, there were some Red Cross emergency care workers who were photographed, and this photo ended up all over many papers throughout the United States and elsewhere. And it was 3 workers, I believe, who had fallen asleep. They were up against some mesh fencing that had been put up around the area they were trying to sort of clean up after the awful disaster. And these 3 individuals were asleep, and there was a terrible cartoon, note after that, something sarcastic that some journalist wrote, something like, asleep on the job. Well, guess what? Turns out they've been awake for more than 36 hours, and it doesn't matter how motivated you are, although motivation is something that can override sleep temporarily. I'm certainly good at that myself, but eventually there is a biological drive to sleep. So that's process S. Process C relates to circadian rhythms, and just a brief little bit. Again, I'm not going to spend we could do a whole class just on circadian rhythms. You could do a whole course or a whole semester on circadian rhythms. But again, as I said earlier, that relates to our biological clock. And there are times throughout the day, or throughout a 24-hour period. The human clock is about 24.3, but there are individual differences. Chuck Seisler, who's at Harvard, really demonstrated now, 15 years ago or so, there was a belief that the biological clock, the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, might vary from 24 to 28 hours. That is not true. It's pretty clear that it hovers around 24.3 or so. There is terrific and exciting research being done on adolescents by my colleague Mary Carskadden to try to get a sense developmentally of whether that clock changes prior to puberty, throughout puberty, and then post-adolescence. But that's sort of the number we still talk about, 24.3 or so. But what's more important is to understand that depending on where core body temperature is, internal body temperature is, or where melatonin is, which is a hormone secreted by the pineal gland, as well as other external, what we call Zeitgebers, other factors out in the environment, where your clock is. And you're going to be, as I said earlier when we were talking about motor vehicle accidents, you're also going to be more sleepy or more alert throughout the day, not just based on when you last slept, so not just based on process S, but also based on where your clock is. And so there are particular times during 24 hours where we're more alert or we're more awake. For example, whatever our individual time is that we're most likely to fall asleep in the evening as humans, we are diurnal. So for me, that's going to be around 10:30. About an hour to an hour and a half before that, my melatonin level is peaking. It's going to be at its highest level, troughing closer to the ideal time for me when I'm going to wake up in the morning. But then throughout the 24 hours, melatonin and core body temperature peak and trough as well. So you have the sleep load that I've talked about, the sleep-wake homeostatic process, process S. You have our circadian drive for wakefulness is what it's referred to. Again, so this is pointing out different times throughout the 24-hour period where we're more likely to be asleep or awake. And again, this is the evening hour as human beings. And then we have wake propensity, which is referring to all the other factors that are going to influence our ability to maintain wakefulness throughout the day, which refers to lighting, which refers to other individual factors. It might refer to be included, as I said, substances that are in your body, types of food we're eating, our moods, and so on. So this graph works really well. I do think that high school students can understand it. It's easy to get. I have the reference here. But I think the key question when you're talking to your own high school students and talking to adolescents, or my talking to you about them today, is why do adolescents struggle against going to sleep in the evening and struggling to wake up in the morning? And we're basically going to talk about that for a couple of minutes. Couple cartoons. These are great. I don't know, those of you, since you teach high school students, if you're familiar with Zits. I think anyone who works with adolescents needs to read the Zits cartoon on a regular basis. Funny story, my colleague, and who is really one of the preeminent and founders of understanding adolescence and sleep, Mary Carskadden, who is at Brown. I was at a holiday party. This is now back, I want to say 5 years ago, and she had little grab bag gifts that you could pick up, and she did these desk calendars for everybody. And this happened to be other people picked up all kinds of desktop calendars. I happened to pick up the Zits calendar, and literally, this is January 31st of that, the next year, for days in a row, the cartoons were about sleep. It was hysterical about adolescent sleep. So a couple just great ones that are so poignant in terms of the questions that we're talking about today. Whoa, look at the snow. Whoa, tobogganing, build a snowman, cross-country skiing, make caramel corn. What should we do first? Well, by first, I assume you mean after going back to bed for 5 hours or so, talking with his mother. And then I love this pose. Is this generational or developmental? Your generation totally messed up the planet through its greed, incompetence, and apathy. You're probably the most arrogant group of people in history. Well, I'm sure your generation will do a better job. Should any of you ever manage to get out of bed before noon? And why do you always have to be so critical? I'll let you answer that question. And then I have these reverse, I apologize, but if you sort of look at these from January 9th and January 10th, again, it was absolutely hysterical. It was just one after the next. So he's yawning, he's in the kitchen. Poor baby, you were up late doing homework and you fell asleep on your desk again. Yeah, how'd you know? You can spot the really dedicated students by the spiral notebook marks on their cheeks. or those who are getting insufficient amounts of sleep. And then here we go. So what goes on as we move on to college? It seems wrong for you to have 6 hours of homework every night, Jeremy. It's not just me, Mom. Everybody has it. That's just the way it is. And the AP classes only make it worse. Not AP Psych. Then it's going to be like this all through high school. Yeah, most of us are looking forward to starting college so we can get some rest. I know. So what happens? So adolescence, and I don't know what definition you use, Nancy. I mean, I think I talk about sort of straight through the college years, you know, as your colleague talks about whether, you know, at what point are the college years emerging adulthood, or are they still adolescence, is, I think, a question. You know, I think you've thought about this before, and it's probably worthwhile to remind your students of this when you're talking, and that's that the vast amount of psychology research as well as health science research has been done on college-age students in the United States and elsewhere, and still to this day in a totally adevelopmental perspective. In other words, and sleep included, we know far more today about adolescent sleep than we do about sleep in the college years. And a lot of studies are done on sort of learning and sleep and memory and sleep and so on, using college students as research subjects without thinking about that from a developmental perspective. It is starting to change, but it remains a serious concern in my opinion. So one example of that, before I go through this, but while I'm thinking about it, is I'm going to talk about developmental changes that occur over this period of time with regard to sleep and circadian timing, and yet we know very little about what happens from age about 18 to 22. There's a little bit of research, and I'll comment on it in a minute. But in other words, when does sleep look more adult-like? Remains a question. When does that occur? And what are the factors that influence that? In other words, is that environmental? Is that something going on that's physiological or biological? Does that have to do with the type of lifestyle you lead over those years, and so on? But what we do know is that adolescents self-report, as well as using other measurement techniques, less sleep than younger children. They start to show irregular sleep-wake schedules sometime towards the late elementary school age years and middle school years. In other words, their sleep schedule looking different during the week from on weekends. That bed and rise times become increasingly more delayed, that is to say, going to bed later and naturally waking up later over the same period of time. That school wake or rise times are constrained, are very much related to the timing of whatever your school district sets that schedule for. That the amount of sleep or the sleep length over the adolescent years declines. And I'll show you some graphs that demonstrate that. And that the size of the school night to weekend discrepancy, both timing and amount, is tied to, as I already said, very negative outcomes. The more erratic your sleep-wake schedule is, has negative implications for cognitive functioning, for emotional well-being, for risk for substance abuse, and so on. These are old graphs, but I just keep them in my battery of numbers of slides because study after study has demonstrated this. This is data from 3,000 high school students from Rhode Island from back in the late 1990s. Sounds like back in the day. And you can see bedtimes getting later over the high school years. This is self-report data, but actigraphy data, which I'll comment on in a minute, replicates these findings. This is data from a study that was published just about a year and a half ago, where they gathered together a number of studies that have looked at adolescent sleep, actually from the early adolescent years through age 18. And what you can see, although the studies vary in terms of where the populations were studied across the world, this is worldwide data. The researcher here is actually from Australia, but you can see the same pattern. In other bedtimes, if you look at the graph in the broadest perspective, bedtimes getting later. Same with the total amount of sleep. Again, you can see sleep gets, and there's about a 40-minute difference. This was statistically significant. Again, this is reported now in study after study. And again, similarly, slightly less extreme when you pull a number of studies together, but you can see that if you look at a lot of data sets, you see the same findings. There's some variability country to country, but the overall pattern is the same. This is actigraphy. Let me say, are you familiar with what actigraphy is? Is that something? So let me say a little bit about it. It's not something that you would easily be able to do with your, well, I shouldn't say that. These days with what's happening with cell phones and whatnot, you might be able to. Actigraphy is the way that we estimate sleep in the field. In other words, you can't study 200 middle school students and bring them into a sleep lab to understand their sleep. So we estimate sleep in a more objective way in adolescents, and this is what my lab does, by using actigraphy, which is based on accelerometer technology. It looks like a watch. Sleep researchers and other behavioral scientists learned many, many years ago that we can use movement to estimate sleep. That is to say, we are on average far more active, even when you're sitting here listening to me, when we're awake than when we're asleep. So corroborated with sleep-wake diaries, we use actigraphy to estimate. It's not measuring sleep, and I always remind my students, this is not measuring sleep. It is estimating sleep, the same way self-report is estimating whatever it is that we're trying to get at. So this looks like a watch band. These new actigraphs that I'm using in my lab also measure light, and so I'm very interested in the impact of light on adolescent sleep. But this is what it looks like. Now, what?
Measure movement?
Measures movement. Well, this one measures movement and light. Accelerometer technology is, for those of you who are techie folks, is what's in iPads and cell phones and so on. And in fact, there is an accelerometer in most iPads and smartphones. And in fact, you can get simple, and I would just say experiment yourselves with your students, you can now get apps on their cell phones and on iPads that would allow you to just do a simple experiment. They could actually fill out a sleep-wake diary and use one of the apps if they have a smartphone, or if you have a few that they can share, and could actually do a simple experiment comparing what their self-reported sleep-wake information is by using the accelerometer technology on an iPad or an iPhone. Lark is the company to look up. If you look that company up, it's possible even, they're very inexpensive. So in addition to you being able to just play with an app, you could now get some very inexpensive actigraphs. Perhaps if you have, I don't know, budget sizes, and some of you may be in school districts where this would be absolutely impossible, but those of you who are in a school district where you could, pretty minimally, this company called Lark, L-A-R-K, now makes a device for the general public that is similar to these $1,000 actigraphs that we use in my lab for just a couple $100. So you might be able to even purchase a couple, or over a couple of years slowly purchase them and use them to do some very interesting projects with your students where they could compare their data from accelerometer technology to self-report. Neat stuff. And I use this as a segue to talk about, this is just real data from my lab, where we were looking at middle school students, two different samples. This is 6th, 7th, and 8th grade from one district, and then some 7th grade data here from Worcester. And again, this is just giving you a sense that it's less so in the early middle school years, but what you're basically seeing is the amount of sleep that kids are getting over this middle school period of time. And what you're seeing is, although it looks like these Worcester kids were getting more sleep, the main thing I want you to look at is how much less sleep 8th graders were getting from 6th and 7th graders. So corroborating with self-report. And this is same with sleep onset time. We actually use the term onset when we're using actigraphy to differentiate that between, that's really the estimated time someone falls asleep, as opposed to bedtime being the time you might get into bed. So that's just a slightly different terminology. Again, getting later from 6th grade versus 8th grade. And this is what an actigram looks like. So when you get data from actigraphy, this is what it looks like. And basically you're looking at a week's worth of time here on the y-axis. On the x-axis is time. This is 9 o'clock in the morning to excuse me, 9 o'clock. Yeah, 9 o'clock in the morning is over here. But basically what you're looking at is the dark area is showing when the person is awake, that's movement. And this red area is when sleep is being scored by the program that we use in my lab. But that's corroborated. We score that also relative to diary times, and I won't go into detail about that. But what I want you to look at here, which is again something you could do with your students, and I'll send you to a website if you don't even have Actigraphy and you just want to get samples of this. If you go to either the Ambulatory Monitoring website, AMI. They're one of the companies that makes the type of actigraph I'm passing out. You could also go to the Respironics website, and they have all their product information, but with the product information, they have sample actigrams, if you just wanted to show your students. But what's most striking about the difference between these two actigrams, without even knowing numbers or anything? So first of all, right, this 7th grade male has a much more regular sleep-wake pattern. I mean, it's clean as a bell that he's going to falling asleep about the same time and waking up about the same time every single day across that week. And this female, and I'm not trying to suggest gender differences. I mean, there is research suggesting there may be, but I'm not suggesting that by these two examples. And then this 7th grade female, you can see, is getting significantly less sleep, just eyeballing it. And has a much more erratic sleep-wake schedule. It's pretty profound. I'm going to just move on here. Okay. So now, what I've mentioned so far has to do with self-report and actigraphically estimated sleep-wake patterns over this adolescent period. And as we've said, they're getting less sleep and they're going to bed later. Pretty much, if you look at data sets from age 11 or 6th grade through the end of the high school years, you see this distinct pattern. But what else is going on? There are also some very striking and remarkable changes that are also occurring. First of all, we have very clear research that was done all the way back in the 1980s by Mary Carskadden and colleagues that demonstrated that sleep need does not change over the adolescent years or from elementary school through adolescence. That is to say, prior to the early 1980s, that's not what's exactly on this graph here, prior to the 1980s, there was a belief that we need less and less sleep as we get older. You know, people used to imagine literally you would sort of, get to be 75 and you could get by on no sleep. There was these assumptions about a linear story. That's just not true at all. Beautiful study done in the early 1980s by my colleague Mary Carskadden and William Dement, who is one of the sort of grandfathers of modern sleep science, in the lab when REM sleep was developed. She was his graduate student. They did a study where they brought over consecutive years, they followed the same kids who were Tanner stage 0 or 1, so prepubescent, through Tanner stage 5, fully developed. They followed these kids both individually and looking at them as a group over several years. And in this study, they would bring them into a sleep lab for a week. They were allowed to sleep as long as they could every night, although they were awakened after about 10 hours every single morning. And what they discovered is, regardless of Tanner stage and regardless of chronological age, that the mean amount of sleep over that period, both following these kids longitudinally as well as individually, was 9.2 hours. And almost, in fact, they rarely talk about the standard deviations from that study because they were virtually non-existent. In other words, very little individual differences, both within individual and over time. And if anything, it was the Tanner stage 4 and 5 kids and the older adolescents around age 15 who actually had to be awakened at the 10-hour point and not the younger adolescents. It's a beautiful study. It's never been entirely replicated, but it is used to demonstrate sleep need, and most people accept it as really at least understanding the fact that regardless of the exact amount, that sleep need does not change over that period of time. So if you think back to those self-report graphs I showed you, that means that the younger adolescents, the 6th graders are probably getting an adequate amount of sleep or a sufficient amount of sleep. And as kids get older, they are increasingly more sleep deprived. They get further from that 9.2 hour mark. Very, very important study that is still talked about this many years later. What I also want to talk about is some data from a study that I was a co-author on, and that was a study that was done. We called it the sleep start time study, and it was really one of the first studies that in a laboratory setting to demonstrate the problem with early school start times relative to adolescent sleep need and timing of sleep. And so I'll say a little bit about this study because it really gives you a sense of how difficult it is for your students in your high schools and then the students you're teaching when you talk about this topic to function with an early school start time. So in this study, we studied adolescents. These were 9th graders transitioning to 10th grade in some Rhode Island schools. And we studied them in the spring of 9th grade, the summer before 10th grade, and the fall of 10th grade. This was an old-fashioned school district. There aren't too many like this anymore, where they still called it junior high. And the kids were transitioning from 9th to 10th grade. High school started in 10th grade. But what was key and why we chose this school district is there was an over-hour difference between the time they started 9th grade in junior high or middle school and what time they were going to have to start 10th grade in the fall of 10th grade. And we were interested in seeing what was going to happen over that period of time, both in terms of their real life. So they wore actigraphs for a week. We got a sense based on the actigraphs of what their school week sleep-wake schedule was. Then we brought them into the sleep lab either on a Friday or a Saturday night, but we kept them on their school night sleep-wake schedule. So if they went to bed at 11, that's what time they were allowed to go to sleep. And if they were waking up to go to school at 6, that's the time they were awakened on either Saturday or Sunday morning in the sleep lab. But what we also studied is prior to their time they were going to sleep, we collected salivary melatonin, which is what's used to estimate where their circadian clock is, the timing of their own clock, and I won't go into all the details of that, but we did that. So they were spitting to collect saliva before their own estimated sleep onset time. And then the following morning, again, after they were awakened, after they'd been on their school schedule all week going to school, came into the sleep lab, we kept them that night. We didn't let them binge sleep. So they got that minute, whatever the number of hours. If they were getting 7 hours of sleep, they got 7 hours of sleep that night. And then we did the MSLT, this what we called laboratory nap test, during the day at 8:30 a.m., 10:30 a.m., 12:30, and 2:30. To see how long it took them to fall asleep. We wanted to get an objective estimate of how sleepy they were on this short sleep-wake schedule they were on with the various school start times. Okay? And so what we found is that when we compared, I won't talk about the summer, but when we compared spring of 9th grade to say March, April, we always make sure we collect data. We pay attention to when the clocks are being changed. And then the same thing in the fall after they'd been in the new high school schedule for about a month. What you're seeing here is 10th grade data. So what you're seeing is the mean number of minutes that it took them to fall asleep on the 8:30 nap test, that's sort of our colloquial name for that, was about 5 minutes. That is pathological. And these kids were screened for both their own history of narcolepsy and a family history of narcolepsy and other sleep disorders. These are kids who are normal, no sleep disorders. These kids looked like they had narcolepsy. And in fact, 50% of these kids on the 8:30 nap test went into REM sleep. Wow. This study was published in 1998. I'm not saying this because of my involvement in it. It has not been replicated, but it is the study that you really have to come back to when you're trying to talk to people about why it is that starting school at 7 o'clock or 7:30 or even 8 o'clock in the morning for middle school and high school students is highly problematic. You're basically asking kids to come study calculus or pre-calculus or AP psychology or 10th grade English and read Shakespeare or whatever you're doing in your courses when their drive to sleep, because they're so sleep deprived and because there's a circadian phase delay, which we haven't gotten to yet, is problematic. Because the other thing that's going on is it isn't just that these kids are sleep deprived, it's also that we know, and I'm not going to go into all the detail of the studies, that study, I should say, that I've just talked about also suggested the circadian sleep delay. But what we know is that also over these years, there's a delay in the timing of sleep that isn't just, oh, there's lots going on, I want to stay awake to socialize. That's part of it. That's absolutely part of it, as the slide suggests. But what we also know is that when you remove the environmental constraints, there's a delay in the timing of sleep as well. So what does that mean? On that same study that I mentioned, we found that the kids, that their melatonin over this developmental period of time, that the time that melatonin was peaking was getting later in the evening, regardless of other factors, when you're controlling other factors. And so that means that the clock is basically shifting, and the time that you're going to naturally fall asleep, regardless of all the external factors, is later in the day. So there's two sort of major variables that are coming together over this adolescent period to sort of create the perfect storm for why adolescents are so sleep deprived, and why, of course, many of us would argue that early high school start times are creating a perfect storm, so to speak, or adding to the perfect storm. So just 1 second. Can I just finish just 1 second? So between if you do the math and you say, okay, we know from research done all the way back in the 1980s that sleep need is about 9 hours. We all often say 8.5 to 9.5 hours. And you don't have to be a mathematician to then look at, but the time that the average adolescent is likely to be biologically able to fall asleep, say, is 11 o'clock, 11:30, and then you draw out those 9 hours. Any of your school districts that are starting before about 8:30 in the morning are creating or adding to the perfect storm. Your question, sorry.
You said 5 minutes was pathological.
Yes, falling asleep in under 5 minutes, okay, if you should have gotten an adequate amount of sleep during the night, suggests sleep deprivation.
So like,
right.
okay. What about for adults as well?
Oh, absolutely. You mean the amount of sleep is different. The sleep need for adults is more about 8 hours, and there's been similar research to demonstrate that. But, oh, absolutely, yeah. And so that's just showing you, the sleep-wake schedule of an adult versus a teenager, and the red line showing you the delayed timing of the clock. So just one more study I want to mention that's really interesting. A lot of people ask, and your high school students might ask you this, all these changes are going on if you're talking about adolescent development. Well, what comes first? Because a lot of kids will say, well, I remember feeling like I could stay up later, and I was only in 6th grade, and I don't think I was very developed, Professor Wolfson. I think I still looked like, I don't think too many boys will say this, but, I still looked like I was 10, even though I was 14. But I think I was staying up later. So what's the order of this? And we don't really know this. It's possible from a study done by some colleagues of mine, Avi Sadeh, who's at the University of Tel Aviv, and Ron Dahl, and some others, studied youngsters, 9 to 11-year-olds, boys and girls. And what they were able to demonstrate in this study, but it has not been replicated, is it looked like pubertal changes in sleep, as they called them, that is to say more disrupted sleep, more erratic sleep, more delayed sleep, less sleep, these variables that I'm talking about, using actigraphy, seem to actually precede bodily changes, so Tanner staging. And so it's possible that some of the sleep changes may almost be precursors to the onset or adolescent development. It has not been replicated, and there's a number of holes that can be punched in this study, although it's an elegant study, but I think it's important to keep in mind. The other, this field, there's a new study published constantly now in this field, but another really interesting 2005 study by Oscar Yenny, and actually Mary Carskadden was involved in this study, and others, also suggests, remember back to process S? Also suggests that there might be a slower accumulation of the sleep-wake homeostatic pressure, this drive to sleep, this biological drive to sleep, over the adolescent period of time, which may almost create a myth for adolescents because they think they can stay up later because they're able to kind of push against that biological drive to sleep more than they could when they were younger. That's not to say they don't still need that sleep, but we as adults get basically better and better at holding off that biological drive to sleep, even though we need to sleep. And I call this the sleepover problem, my own name. And many of you may be parents or currently have kids in your home, and you know, it's the famous case of when you have a 10-year-old, or let's just say a 7-year-old, and I don't know, sleepovers have just got so popular. Even I remember being shocked that my 6-year-old was invited to sleep over someone's house, okay? And you sleep over, if you let them, but let's go with the 9-year-old, the 10-year-old, and they sleep over their best friend's house, and right, it's hell to pay, excuse my language, on Sunday. If you're the parent, now they're home with you, and you know, trying to get that child to do homework or be cooperative, I don't care. Even the best well-behaved kid is awful on that Sunday, right? I remember thinking, please, no sleepovers. Whereas if you think about it, your 11th grader might have hung out with friends and been up quite late, and they act sort of okay on Sunday. It's not so bad. They seem to, at least those that function relatively well, manage to get by, in quotes. That's what this that's the behavioral story that's tied to that research study. Okay, I've talked about this study already, so I'm going to pass through this and get to here. So this is not my diagram. I actually found this quite a number of years ago online at this website, scienceblogs.com, 2006, and I've jazzed it up a little bit. But I think this basically summarizes everything we've talked about already, and I think it's a nice graph to think about what's going on for the adolescent, the vicious cycle of the teenager's sleep. So let's start at the top. Does this thing have a pointer? Yeah, if you start at the top. So as we've already said, due to both the circadian clock delays, delay in the circadian timing of sleep, as well as adolescents, all the activities that adolescents are involved in, they stay up later and later over the adolescent years. You know, the latest hot one, and I'll show you a little bit of data on that, is, you know, text messaging, etc. It's awful, by the way. We're just in an awful stage. You know, the cell phone left on all night long, and adolescents answer and text message all night long.
I'm living this right now.
Yeah, I mean, basically, really, we should be removing cell phones from the bedroom. Okay, so gets later and later. They need this sleep requirement, but they're accumulated sleep debt over the week. Also, what's going on is they're getting an inadequate amount of sleep because they have to get up so early in the morning because of early school start times. So then what happens on the weekends? They sleep in, they go on back on their natural schedule, and they also are binge sleeping. So in other words, on the weekend, you're staying up later, going to bed late Friday night, later Saturday night, sleeping in Sunday morning. What happens on Sunday night? You can't fall asleep, right? It's even later than before. And so the cycle starts all over again. Particularly problematic in school districts where kids have to be in school before, I would say, 8:30, 8:45 in the morning. Again, do the math, okay? So and some of you are probably living or experiencing or working with adolescents where your students are coming to school And they're starting school at a time that might be up to 2.5 hours earlier than what fits their schedule. Okay. So you reinforce the circadian, this gets reinforced. They're up even later Sunday night. Some kids may already be using alcohol to fall asleep or doing something or borrowing or looking for sedatives. Kids who are at risk for substance abuse, I think that is going on. So they can't fall asleep Sunday night. Sleep gets restricted. You start to see all the consequences of this during the week for some kids. Academic difficulties, emotional lability, even risk for depression. And again, I've mentioned drowsy driving. And then I think kids are using their own countermeasure. I don't think we have enough research to prove that yet, but I think we have a percentage of adolescents who are using their own countermeasure. In other words, they're intervening. You're teaching psych, they're not doing the best intervention. They're using their own intervention, okay? Dunkin' Donuts, etc. We'll talk a little bit about some of this, and then we're gonna have some fun momentarily. Okay, so I literally on each of these topics could do a lecture and talk to you, and you'll have to choose where you want to go with this with your students if you develop a unit on sleep and adolescent sleep in your psych classes or in other courses that you teach. I mean, there's a growing, fascinating research on social class and culture. I've become very interested in how many of you teach anyone teach in inner city or urban districts? So I think you have a whole added issue for kids in those areas and a very understudied area. I think I may have given you the study to read. We have data now from Worcester public schools, where we have a very high percentage of children living in the school district at or below the poverty line. You can see you're in one of the neighborhoods here at Clark University. And these children are living in environments where they're sharing bedrooms, possibly there's an infant in the same room that a 9th grader is sleeping, where there are greater noise levels, more televisions than even in upper middle class families, possibly noisy neighborhoods. So in addition, possibly families working shift schedules where people come in and out of the homes. And in published data now, and my study is one among a number, suggesting that these kids are getting less sleep and have more erratic sleep-wake schedules. Not surprising, I don't mean to sound naive about this, but finally some data than kids who are in middle class and upper middle class families. You put those students in school districts that start early in the morning and you put them at greater risk. You don't have to, again, sort of do the research, even though I'm all about research, to draw those conclusions. Whole area. Screens and media, growing. I mean, your students will love, and again, if you email me, there are some fun studies now coming out that you can talk with your students about. The National Sleep Foundation did a survey where they over-surveyed high school students and college age or emerging adults to get a sense of the impact of technology on sleep. And one of the most cogent and striking findings, and if you go to the National Sleep Foundation website, you can get this data. Happy to help you find it. But just one stat alone is just so compelling. And it's as follows. I think it was about 19% of the 13 to 18-year-olds and the 19 to I think it was 22-year-olds or some such cutoff, so again, high school and college age, self-reported that at least a couple times a week they were waking up to respond to or send a text message. 19%. And these were thousands of telephone surveyed individuals. Okay, that is basically that's like creating sleep apnea with text messaging. Back to your question. Employment, there is some compelling work that I did quite a number of years ago, and I think there needs to be more work done in this area, but high school students, there was work done by Lawrence Steinberg, who's a developmental psychologist many years ago. He's probably cited in some of your textbooks that you use, where he looked at employment in adolescents. And you know, it's first of all far more likely that upper middle class kids in this, I mean, again, things have changed with the economy, but that for quite a long time, middle and upper middle class high school students were working, who didn't necessarily have to work for financial reasons, and those working 20 hours a week or more, in addition to going to high school, were actually at greater risk for academic difficulties than those not working. And people tend to think the opposite. Sometimes parents think the opposite. Oh, it creates, you know, great, you know, confidence, etc. Well, unfortunately, also is sleep. Adolescents who work 20 hours or more a week actually have grossly more inadequate and more irregular sleep-wake schedules than adolescents who don't work at all or who work under 20 hours. So the risk factor seems to be the 20 hours or more. So again, some interesting work. And then caffeine, I'll talk a little bit about that, and of course, high school start times. I love some of the things, some of the kinds of sort of media things that you can show your students that are so disturbing, or in this case, maybe not disturbing, but a suggestion of how concerned people are getting about these issues. This was from, I was on a trip, American Airlines, their magazine, American Airlines magazine, and one of the main articles in this issue, March 2010, was about families who were sending their kids to camps that were going unplugged, back to the old days. Real letter writing, no emails, no websites where you can see your kids online, and so on. So let me just back up. So I didn't actually, I didn't end up including the studies on this topic, but I'm happy to make suggestions. There's a growing literature clearly demonstrating, as I said, about the impact of technology. Caffeine, I did want to just say a little bit about this study that I was involved in, just to sort of get you thinking about this as a whole area to pay attention to. First of all, prevalence. If you compare alcohol and marijuana and tobacco, okay, those are the sort of latest prevalence data, and yet if you look at caffeine, adolescents increase of 70% in the past 30 years in terms of caffeine use. So when people say, oh, but my parents let me have coffee, like I think back, my parents, you know, it was Sunday mornings, I got to have my cafe au lait with breakfast or whatever. We're living in a whole nother world now in terms of caffeine. Yeah.
Now that there's research that backs this up, should there be either nationwide or school-wide or statewide policy?
It's a great question.
As teachers, I know we see more Red Bull and Starbucks than in the last 2 years, Monster that I've seen. And do the schools need to step it up, colleges and high schools both, and say, we're going to ban this?
You guys should start talking about it, absolutely. I'm part of a group. We have a policy statement that will be coming out soon on school start times that will be published in the American Academy of Pediatrics. And with that, we have an updated adolescent sleep report that's going to be also published, where we've written a caffeine section. We weren't ready to actually make policy statements yet, but I think that that's where we're heading. As you know, Bill Clinton was very involved in this pushing the American Beverage Association a couple of years ago. He got involved, and it was all around obesity, and so there's now a ban, I think, or I don't know if it's how enforced it is, but most, I think, schools and other public settings, middle school, you can't have sodas or certain types of beverages in your vending machines. But high schools, because the focus there was on sugar and not caffeine, can have Diet Coke in vending machines because they didn't pay attention to caffeine. Caffeine was not the issue. Yes, I mean, I think it's very, very disturbing, and I mean, I would encourage those of you who are in the secondary school world to start talking about it. I mean, it's Red Bull in particular. I'm going to show you a slide. Red Bull in particular is a very scary company, in my opinion, in terms of its marketing athletes, basically, and now it used to be high-risk sports where they would be showing up and advertising, promoting their products, but now I understand if your students are on the tennis team, the golf team, it doesn't matter the type of sport, the Red Bull machines are showing up in golf settings and tennis, yeah, and so on. But I can tell you a little bit about the data too, but yeah.
I just think this is a good opportunity for us as teachers.
Absolutely.
This would be a great debate topic.
Absolutely.
Give them an opportunity to look at some of the numbers, your studies, and take into consideration their own wants and needs. And, you know, what keeps coming to mind is you snooze, you lose.
Mm-hmm.
And then thinking that's the pressure that many of them are living with. So maybe on one side of it, they're going to be like, well, yeah, I'm not losing.
And from a research perspective, so the sleep world for so long with adults talked about caffeine as a countermeasure, believe it or not. Okay, so if you're talking about pilots, we would say, well, a little caffeine might, if you can't get on the right schedule, might help if you can't get that 30-minute nap. And there's been research demonstrating that it has the same kind of positive implications. So for those of us who are getting on an airplane, we'd like to have that pilot, if the pilot's not on a great schedule, to have their Red Bull, or to be put on a prescription for modafinil, which is a stimulant used to treat narcolepsy, but off-label used to treat other forms of sleepiness and fatigue. But we're talking about a really different scene when we're talking about adolescents. So absolutely. And I'm going to do a different exercise, but yes, you could do an exercise.
You know, I haven't seen the 5-hour energy too
What?
much in my school.
You haven't seen what?
5-hour energy. I don't know why kids aren't really going on to that one. Because, I mean, I don't know about anybody else at the other schools, but I just don't see it as much. It's advertised as much on TV, but I don't see kids walking around with it.
They probably drink it at their locker.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know. Again, I didn't bring it. If you Google the history on. This is a hot topic. All right, let me take 2 more questions, and then I'd like to move on. Yeah.
Are there any studies correlating early school start times with lower academic performance in those first or second period classes? In other words,
I'm going to show you some of that data in just a minute, but not specifically on those lower academic performance, but not necessarily tied to specific class periods.
I'd like to, in my school, try to push this issue. We start at 7:40. Anecdotally, for me, it's a disaster.
Hold off. We're gonna do an exercise in just a second. Okay. I'm gonna ask to just hold off questions for just one more minute. What I just want to show you here, so just so you know, these are the implications of caffeine in sleep. Reduces slow wave sleep, increases sleep onset latency and night awakenings, not surprising. Decreases sleep efficiency, not surprising. Decreases the amount of sleep, increases morning sleepiness, and obviously a negative impact on sleep quality. And this has been found in adolescents as well. And I'm just going to move on. What I do want to point out, I'm going to move. This is a data set we have. I just want to show you one finding. Of close to 200 high school students, a convenience sample, school district, a kind of working class school district in central Massachusetts. But what I do want to show you is this. We broke this sample into 3 groupings. We broke them down into, again, virtually all the kids, 96% were using some amount of caffeine. But we were able to categorize the kids as 9th through 12th grade, and there were no age differences in this study, no year in school differences, to a mixed use group. So these were kids who were using caffeine, all different types, okay, to what we call a high soda use, that pretty much their use was in soda and not in other types of beverages. This study, by the way, was done prior to the Red Bull craze, just prior, so energy drinks were not the big item. And a low caffeine user, not a non-use user, a low user. And we found really strikingly different behavioral patterns between these 3 groups. We found that those who were the mixed use group tended to use caffeine earlier in the day. They were consuming more caffeine pills. Again, they were a mixed use group, and they woke up earlier on school days, and they reported more daytime sleepiness. But it's the next bullet that's the most interesting. When you compared the 2 high-use users, mixed use versus soda, really different, what we called reasons for use and expectancies for use, which is how these are terms that the substance abuse literature uses. The mixed use kids, males and females, were more likely to use caffeine to acknowledge that they were using caffeine to get through the day, to have fun and experiment, and in the red, expected more dependence symptoms and energy enhancement. And so my colleague, who's a substance use researcher in adolescents, is really struck by these findings, Alison Ludden, in the sense that she is starting to, as I said earlier this morning, to think of possibly the caffeine in a particular group of kids, possibly those who are most affected by sleep deprivation as well, as a high-risk group. It isn't just that they're having the Red Bull and when high school's over that they're done with it. And there's now more and more research about this, that there's high correlations between Red Bull and marijuana use and so on. But that's not what we're, and I just love this. This was, I was skiing with my husband, and this was in Canada. And this is a hut, this is not part of a ski lodge. Red Bull has now positioned itself, I guess they have permission, to stick Red Bull vending, not machines, in this case, cute little ski hut, right? That's just a freestanding hut, and there's no person there. There's just machines you can go to put your coins in right at the bottom by the chairlift to get your Red Bull. It's amazing. But this has been around forever. My son goes to school in Schenectady, New York, where Union is. And this was on the board. This is near the GE plant in Schenectady. And drink Coca-Cola relieves fatigue, sold for 5 cents. So it's not as if we haven't attempted these, marketers haven't tried this before. Okay, so I'm going to actually move on. I'm not going to go through these slides and get to school start times. Okay. So what do we do? What kinds of preventive interventions can we develop? You're talking to kids, students in a psychology class, to make sure, because we know that insufficient sleep and erratic sleep has negative consequences for mood, possibly for risk for substance abuse, for academic performance issues. I could have done a whole class also on the latest research on memory, on cognition, and all the variables that relate to academic performance, more at an experimental level. What are we going to do about it? And so you've been making comments all morning long about the question of school start times. I want to say a little bit about that, and then we're going to have some fun with this. And again, an exercise that you can replicate with your students. So I tend to, and this is actually not just psychology terminology, but sort of those who were in the transportation industry use the terminology countermeasures. So not just therapeutic interventions, but countermeasures, or public health individuals use this term. So we have systematic countermeasures that we need to be thinking about to increase sleep or get adolescents to have more regular sleep-wake schedules. The one that's talked about the most these days, in my opinion, thankfully, is delaying middle school and high school start times. I'm not sharing data here this morning, but you should know that times have gotten earlier and earlier since the early 1980s, and there is data to suggest that, and a number of theories about it. One has to do with bus schedules. Another has to do with growth of sort of suburbia and kind of the sprawl, urban sprawl. Another has to do with, that you would find fascinating, as high school teachers, and that's the push from public school teachers in the United States back in the late 70s and into the 1980s for salary needs. And in some states they're not being met. And so teachers are arguing that they needed to have a second job. And so high school teachers wanting schools to start earlier so that they could have a second job. There's been some discussion about that. But they seem to be here to stay. That's the story. School start times, with the exception of the districts that are working hard to delay school start times, in terms of the historical data, have gotten earlier and earlier since the 1980s. There's a number of conversations going on. I'm sorry. Employment hours is an interesting discussion, driver's education programs. So all of these, regulation of caffeine, as I'm suggesting, are larger policy-related systematic countermeasures. I don't want you to forget the bottom part of this slide. I think it's a two-pronged, multi-tiered approach, and that is to say we also need to be thinking about preventive intervention programs, education, and what you all can be doing in high schools or in middle schools, in psychology classes, in biology classes, and in health classes if you're in districts that still teach health. In other words, sleep has to be included in the curriculum, and not just at a didactic level, but at a personal level. And that's why I'm very much in favor of you're doing activities or exercises or assignments with your students that get your students to think about change at the individual level and policy change. We all know that if we take an interactive approach, we're more likely to say, whoa, I just collected sleep-wake diary information on my own sleep-wake patterns. Now I see what's going on, and one is more likely to then use that to change behavior. And that would be a whole nother discussion, but I've been doing some of that with the Worcester Public Schools. So what do we know about this research on the actual intervention studies that have been done where districts have systematically changed school start times? And I've sort of put there are now quite a number of studies. If you can really do a review paper now on this area, finally. And in fact, a colleague of mine has just done that, and it'll be a part of a book chapter, demonstrating that delaying school start times has a positive impact both in terms of the amount of sleep, timing of sleep, obviously, and then secondary implications for academic performance, behavior and mood, and so on. So studies have, a number of studies have compared, school start times, for example, 7:30 a.m. versus 8:30 a.m. They are largely convenience samples. Most of them have been self-reported sleep-wake patterns, a few using actigraphy. A number of the studies have looked at transcript academic grades as well as self-reported grades, self-reported emotional well-being. And the general findings are, first of all, adolescents do not stay up later and later. In other words, when you delay school start time, when you go from 7:30 to 8:30, it does not mean that the adolescent then goes to bed at 1 instead of midnight or 11. They don't do that. So what happens is, for the most part, they gain the amount of sleep that you've allowed for by shifting what time they have to be in school. It's really beautiful. I mean, people really, myself included, kind of said, oh my goodness, with all the things that kids can do, are they just going to stay up later? Do some kids stay up later? Yes. But on average, it's 40 to 60 minutes that you increase the amount of sleep. And clinically speaking, it only is about 15 to 20 minutes of sleep that can make a difference. So this is much larger than that, regardless of statistical significance. But not only that, but some studies are showing, I can't say there's a study that shows exactly what hour of the day improved academic performance. Our study that we did here in the Worcester Public Schools, we were not able to show statistical significance for 7th graders, but 8th graders were able to demonstrate improved academic performance on transcript grades. And also, most of the studies report decreased tardiness, which we all know has, kids who are more tardy tend to do less well in school. In our data set, 4 times less tardiness after we delayed school start times. And then also some of the other secondary variables in Judy Owen's study that was done in a private school setting, lower levels of depressed mood, and overall teachers and students being satisfied with delaying school start times. And this is just one of our studies. Okay, so we're going to have some fun. So first of all, I hopefully have enough of it.
Technically, we should have finished it.
Oh, geez, I was thinking 10:30. Oh my God. Okay, then I will just describe. Well, I'll just describe what I think you can do with your students, okay? I'll just describe. We won't actually do the whole exercise, but you can take it back with you. This happens to me. I apologize. I guess in my head I was thinking 10:30. I don't know why. That's so strange. Even though we said 90 minutes, started looking at the clock. So first of all, what I'm going to do, and you can do with your students, is I hand out a blank little piece of paper, a piece of paper which I turn over, and it has a role. So you pretend that you're the student. You can just pass these back. Yeah, just want someone pass them out. Okay. I hopefully have enough, but you'll see they're different roles. And then what you can also pass out, if someone else can just pass these out. If you can pass these out. Everyone should take one of those. So I present to you that, okay, you've now been educated, you've done your homework. Either you are a sleep researcher, or you're a superintendent of schools, or you're an assistant superintendent, you're a principal of an elementary school, a middle school, a high school. You might be a member of your school district's school start time change committee. You're on this committee, you're a rebel rouser, you've agreed to be on this committee. You're a parent. You're a parent of a kindergartner. You're a parent of a third grader. You're a parent of a 10th grader. You're a parent of an early adolescent, a 7th grader. You're a high school teacher. You're a middle school teacher at a school that starts early in the morning, or you're a middle school teacher because in the district you live in, a few middle schools already start later. Or you're an elementary school age teacher. Or you might be a hockey coach, a football coach, a swimming coach. You're an 8th grader yourself, an 11th grader. You're a representative from the National Sleep Foundation who's come in to give a talk to your school district. Or you're a journalist. You're in there in the media and you would like to talk about this story throughout your state, nationally, or just in the school that's, as I call in this project, Sleepy Town, USA. So what I tell the students, and so you can imagine this, we won't actually break into groups, but you can sort of go through it and imagine what it would be like. What I have the students do is I first have them get into groups. And I create the groups. Generally, we'll have sort of a group that, where do I have this list? Oh yeah, sorry. I break you into 3 groups. One group is what I consider sort of the expert group that's gotten together. It's a school start time committee of the school district. And the school start time committee has brought in different experts to advise them and help them do their homework on the issue of adolescent sleep and whether or not the district should change school start times. Group number 2 are school professionals, so they're the teachers and the coaches who have their own little committee who's getting together. They know this school start time committee is going on in their district, but they're meeting after school to talk about it, how do they feel about it, where do they want to go with this. And then often some kind of PTA or parent committee. Okay? And I give the students some time to role play being in those groups for a little while, not long, 5-10 minutes or so. And then I have everybody come back together for a town hall meeting. And the job of the town hall meeting is for each group, first with the school start time committee presenting its recommendations. I generally give the recommendations so they know what they're moving towards. So in this case, their recommendation is that elementary schools change from, change to a certain degree, middle schools change and high schools change, or other times I've done it without any planned recommendations. And then there's a discussion, as if it's real life, because this is how these school districts are doing this often, town hall meeting style, to talk about, are they going to go with the recommendations, what do they want the school board to do? And it's a great way to get your students to see to go from the research that you've been talking about in class to talking about the research themselves from different perspectives. And the assumption is that each of these groups have some access to the information, obviously, but have a different perspective. A parent of a 2nd grader comes into this. If you're a parent of a 2nd grader and it's your oldest child and you haven't had any adolescents yet, and the recommendation is that elementary school is now going to start earlier in the morning in order to accommodate for middle schools and high schools. Most parents of 2nd graders and the students, the high school students and college students get this right away, are often furious. They don't want this for some reason. Or the story of the hockey coach who, wants to have kids, in practice early in the morning. Or the football coach who wants lit fields and is upset unless the school district is going to purchase lights
to allow the kids to practice, starting later if it means the Northeast and it's going to get dark too early in the fall. The football coach is adamantly opposed to changing school start times, regardless of what it does for his or her football players' academic performance and so on. And I am stereotyping a little bit, but you'll see the students fall into those role plays immediately. You would if we had time to do it, and we sort of let that evolve. Sometimes I get involved, sometimes I don't, and it allows for a real discussion of the relationship between research, theoretical understanding of these issues that we've been talking about all morning, and the real life implications. And so I know that we don't have time to do that exercise. It's pretty straightforward, and I think you can do it on your own. So I think we'll end with that. And I guess if we have 5 minutes to do Q&A, does that work for your schedules?
Thank you.